Enfin, monsieur s'est donc décidé. C'est bien alors. J'en suis contente. Her words came to him sonorously, as through a great open space. Then the great figure came suddenly across the flagged hall at him and seized his trembling hands. Some overpowering force moved with her and caught him. On pourrait faire un petit tour ensemble, n'est-ce pas? Nous y allons cette nuit, et il faut s'exercer un peu d'avance pour cela. Il sait. Viens donc ici. Viens vite. And she whirled him round in the opening steps of some dance that seemed oddly and horribly familiar. They made no sound on the stones, this strangely assorted couple. It was all soft and stealthy. And presently, when the air seemed to thicken like smoke, and a red glare as of flame shot through it, he was aware that someone else had joined them, and that his hand the mother had released was now tightly held by the daughter. Ilse had come in answer to the call, and he saw her with leaves of vervain twined in her dark hair, clothed in tattered vestiges of some curious garment, beautiful as the night, and horribly, odiously, loathsomely seductive. "To the Sabbath! To the Sabbath!" he cried. "On to the witches' Sabbath!" Up and down that narrow hall they danced, the women on each side of him, to the wildest measure he had ever imagined, yet which he dimly, dreadfully remembered, till the lamp on the wall flickered and went out, and they were left in total darkness. And the devil woke in his heart with 1,000 vile suggestions and made him afraid. Suddenly they released his hands, and he heard the voice of the mother cry that it was time, and they must go. Which way they went he did not pause to see. He only realized that he was free, and he blundered through the darkness till he found the stairs, and then tore up them to his room as though all hell was at his heels. He flung himself on the sofa with his face in his hands and groaned. Swiftly reviewing a dozen ways of immediate escape, all equally impossible, he finally decided that the only thing to do for the moment was to sit quiet and wait. He must see what was going to happen. At least in the privacy of his own bedroom he would be fairly safe. The door was locked. He crossed over and softly opened the window which gave upon the courtyard, and also permitted a partial view of the hall through the glass doors. As he did so, the hum and murmur of a great activity reached his ears from the streets beyond, the sound of footsteps and voices muffled by distance. He leaned out cautiously and listened. The moonlight was clear and strong now, but his own window was in shadow, the silver disk being still behind the house. It came to him irresistibly that the inhabitants of the town, who a little while before had all been invisible behind closed doors, were now issuing forth, busy upon some secret and unholy errand. He listened intently. At first, everything about him was silent, but soon he became aware of movements going on in the house itself. Rustlings and cheepings came to him across that still, moonlit yard. A concourse of living beings sent the hum of their activity into the night. Things were on the move everywhere. A biting, pungent odour rose through the air, coming he knew not whence. Presently his eyes became glued to the windows of the opposite wall, where the moonshine fell in a soft blaze. The roof overhead, and behind him, was reflected clearly in the panes of glass, and he saw the outlines of dark bodies moving with long footsteps over the tiles and along the coping. They passed swiftly and silently, shaped like immense cats, in an endless procession across the pictured glass, and then appeared to leap down to a lower level, where he lost sight of them. He just caught the soft thudding of their leaps. Sometimes their shadows fell upon the white wall opposite, and then he could not make out whether they were the shadows of human beings or of cats. They seemed to change swiftly from one to the other. The transformation looked horribly real, for they leapt like human beings, yet changed swiftly in the air immediately afterwards, and dropped like animals. The yard, too, beneath him, was now alive with the creeping movements of dark forms, all stealthily drawing towards the porch with the glass doors. They kept so closely to the wall that he could not determine their actual shape, but when he saw that they passed on to the great congregation that was gathering in the hall, he understood that these were the creatures whose leaping shadows he had first seen reflected in the window panes opposite. They were coming from all parts of the town, reaching the appointed meeting place across the roofs and tiles, and springing from level to level till they came to the yard. Then a new sound caught his ear, and he saw that the windows all about him were being softly opened, and that to each window came a face. A moment later figures began dropping hurriedly down into the yard, and these figures, as they lowered themselves down from the windows, were human, he saw. But once safely in the yard, they fell upon all fours and changed in the swiftest possible second into cats. Huge, silent cats. They ran in streams to join the main body in the hall beyond. So, after all, the rooms in the house had not been empty and unoccupied. Moreover, what he saw no longer filled him with amazement, for he remembered it all. It was familiar. It had all happened before, just so, hundreds of times, and he himself had taken part in it, and known the wild madness of it all. The outline of the old building changed. The yard grew larger, and he seemed to be staring down upon it from a much greater height through smoky vapours. And as he looked, half remembering, the old pains of long ago, fierce and sweet, furiously assailed him, and the blood stirred horribly as he heard the call of the dance again in his heart and tasted the ancient magic of Ilse whirling by his side. Suddenly he started back. A great lithe cat had leapt softly up from the shadows below onto the sill close to his face, and was staring fixedly at him with the eyes of a human. "Come," it seemed to say, "come with us to the dance. Change as of old. Transform yourself swiftly and come." Only too well he understood the creature's soundless call. It was gone again in a flash, with scarcely a sound of its padded feet in the stones, and then others dropped by the score down the side of the house, past his very eyes, all changing as they fell and darting away rapidly, softly, towards the gathering point. And again he felt the dreadful desire to do likewise, to murmur the old incantation, and then drop upon hands and knees and run swiftly for the great flying leap into the air. Oh, how the passion of it rose within him like a flood, twisting his very entrails, sending his heart's desire flaming forth into the night for the old, old dance of the sorcerers at the witches' Sabbath. The whirl of the stars was about him. Once more he met the magic of the moon. The power of the wind, rushing from precipice and forest, leaping from cliff to cliff across the valleys, tore him away. He heard the cries of the dancers and their wild laughter, and with this savage girl in his embrace he danced furiously about the dim throne where sat the figure with the sceptre of majesty. Then suddenly all became hushed and still, and the fever died down a little in his heart. The calm moonlight flooded the courtyard, empty and deserted. They had started. The procession was off into the sky, and he was left behind, alone. Vezin tiptoed softly across the room and unlocked the door. The murmur from the streets, growing momentarily as he advanced, met his ears. He made his way with the utmost caution down the corridor. At the head of the stairs he paused and listened. Below him, the hall where they had gathered was dark and still, but through open doors and windows on the far side of the building came the sound of a great throng moving farther and farther into the distance. He made his way down the creaking wooden stairs, dreading yet longing to meet some straggler who should point the way, but finding no one. Across the dark hall, so lately thronged with living, moving things, and out through the open front doors into the street. He could not believe that he was really left behind, really forgotten, that he had been purposely permitted to escape. It perplexed him. Nervously he peered about him and up and down the street, then seeing nothing, advanced slowly down the pavement. The whole town, as he went, showed itself empty and deserted, as though a great wind had blown everything alive out of it. The doors and windows of the houses stood open to the night. Nothing stirred. Moonlight and silence lay over all. The night lay about him like a cloak. The air, soft and cool, caressed his cheek like the touch of a great furry paw. He gained confidence and began to walk quickly, though still keeping to the shadowed side. Nowhere could he discover the faintest sign of the great unholy exodus he knew had just taken place. The moon sailed high over all in a sky cloudless and serene. Hardly realizing where he was going, he crossed the open marketplace and so came to the ramparts, whence he knew a pathway descended to the high road, and along which he could make good his escape to one of the other little towns that lay to the northward, and so to the railway. But first he paused and gazed out over the scene at his feet, where the great plain lay like a silver map of some dream country. The still beauty of it entered his heart, increasing his sense of bewilderment and unreality. No air stirred. The leaves of the plane tree stood motionless. The near details were defined with the sharpness of day against dark shadows, and in the distance the fields and woods melted away into haze and shimmering mistiness. But the breath caught in his throat, and he stood stock-still as though transfixed, when his gaze passed from the horizon and fell upon the near prospect in the depth of the valley at his feet. The whole lower slopes of the hill that lay hid from the brightness of the moon were aglow, and through the glare he saw countless moving forms, shifting thick and fast through the openings of the trees, while overhead, like leaves driven by the wind, he discerned flying shapes that hovered darkly one moment against the sky and then settled down with cries and weird singing through the branches into the region that was aflame. Spellbound, he stood and stared for a time that he could not measure, and then, moved by one of the terrible impulses that seemed to control the whole adventure, he climbed swiftly upon the top of the broad coping and balanced a moment where the valley gaped at his feet. But in that very instant, as he stood hovering, a sudden movement among the shadows of the houses caught his eye, and he turned to see the outline of a large animal dart swiftly across the open space behind him and land with a flying leap upon the top of the wall a little lower down. It ran like the wind to his feet, and then rose up beside him upon the ramparts. A shiver seemed to run through the moonlight, and his sight trembled for a second. His heart pulsed fearfully. Ilse stood beside him, peering into his face. Some dark substance, he saw, stained the girl's face and skin, shining in the moonlight as she stretched her hands towards him. She was dressed in wretched, tattered garments that yet became her mightily. Rue and vervain twined about her temples. Her eyes glittered with unholy light. He only just controlled the wild impulse to take her in his arms and leap with her from their giddy perch into the valley below. "See," she cried, pointing with an arm on which the rags fluttered in the rising wind towards the forest aglow in the distance. "See where they await us. The woods are alive. Already the great ones are there, and the dance will soon begin. The salve is here. Anoint yourself and come." Though a moment before the sky was clear and cloudless, yet even while she spoke the face of the moon grew dark, and the wind began to toss in the crests of the plane trees at his feet. Stray gusts brought the sounds of hoarse singing and crying from the lower slopes of the hill, and the pungent odour he had already noticed about the courtyard of the inn rose about him in the air. "Transform! Transform!" she cried again, her voice rising like a song. "Rub well your skin before you fly. Come with me to the Sabbath, to the madness of its furious delight, to the sweet abandonment of its evil worship. See, the great ones are there, and the terrible sacraments prepared. The throne is occupied. Anoint and come! Anoint and come!" She grew to the height of a tree beside him, leaping upon the wall with flaming eyes and hair strewn upon the night. He too began to change swiftly. Her hands touched the skin of his face and neck, streaking him with a burning salve that sent the old magic into his blood, with a power before which fades all that is good. A wild roar came up to his ears from the heart of the wood, and the girl, when she heard it, leapt upon the wall in the frenzy of her wicked joy. "Satan is there!" she screamed, rushing upon him and striving to draw him with her to the edge of the wall. "Satan has come! The sacraments call us! Come with your dear apostate soul, and we shall worship and dance till the moon dies and the world is forgotten." just saving himself from the dreadful plunge. Vezin struggled to release himself from her grasp, while the passion tore at his reins and all but mastered him. He shrieked aloud, not knowing what he said, and then he shrieked again. It was the old impulses, the old awful habits instinctively finding a voice, for though it seemed to him that he merely shrieked nonsense, the words he uttered really had meaning in them and were intelligible. It was the ancient call, and it was heard below. It was answered. The wind whistled at the skirts of his coat, as the air around him darkened with many flying forms crowding upwards out of the valley. The crying of hoarse voices smote upon his ears, coming closer. Strokes of wind buffeted him, tearing him this way and that along the crumbling top of the stone wall, and Ilse clung to him with her long, shining arms, smooth and bare, holding him fast about the neck. But not Ilse alone, for a dozen of them surrounded him, dropping out of the air. The pungent odour of the anointed body stifled him, exciting him to the old madness of the Sabbath, the dance of the witches and sorcerers doing honour to the personified evil of the world. "Anoint and away! Anoint and away!" they cried in wild chorus about him. "To the dance that never dies! To the sweet and fearful fantasy of evil!" Another moment, and he would have yielded and gone, for his will turned soft, and the flood of passionate memory all but overwhelmed him when, so can a small thing alter the whole course of an adventure. He caught his foot upon a loose stone in the edge of the wall, and then fell with a sudden crash onto the ground below. But he fell towards the houses, in the open space of dust and cobblestones, and fortunately not into the gaping depth of the valley on the farther side. And they, too, came in a tumbling heap about him, like flies upon a piece of food. But as they fell, he was released for a moment from the power of their touch, and in that brief instant of freedom there flashed into his mind the sudden intuition that saved him. Before he could regain his feet, he saw them scrabbling awkwardly back upon the wall, as though bat-like they could only fly by dropping from a height, and had no hold upon him in the open. Then, seeing them perched there in a row like cats upon a roof, all dark and singularly shapeless, their eyes like lamps, the sudden memory came back to him of Ilse's terror at the sight of fire. Quick as a flash he found his matches and lit the dead leaves that lay under the wall. Dry and withered, they caught fire at once, and the wind carried the flame in a long line down the length of the wall, licking upwards as it ran, and with shrieks and wailings the crowded row of forms upon the top melted away into the air on the other side, and were gone with a great rush and whirring of their bodies down into the heart of the haunted valley, leaving Vezin breathless and shaken in the middle of the deserted ground. "Ilse!" he called feebly. "Ilse!" For his heart ached to think that she was really gone to the great dance without him, and that he had lost the opportunity of its fearful joy. Yet at the same time his relief was so great, and he was so dazed and troubled in mind with the whole thing, that he hardly knew what he was saying and only cried aloud in the fierce storm of his emotion. The fire under the wall ran its course, and the moonlight came out again, soft and clear, from its temporary eclipse. With one last shuddering look at the ruined ramparts, and a feeling of horrid wonder for the haunted valley beyond, where the shapes still crowded and flew, he turned his face towards the town and slowly made his way in the direction of the hotel. And as he went, a great wailing of cries and a sound of howling followed him from the gleaming forest below, growing fainter and fainter with the bursts of wind as he disappeared between the houses. "It may seem rather abrupt to you, this sudden tame ending," said Arthur Vezin, glancing with flushed face and timid eyes at Dr. Silence sitting there with his notebook. "But the fact is, from that moment, my memory seems to have failed rather. I have no distinct recollection of how I got home or what precisely I did. It appears I never went back to the inn at all. I only dimly recollect racing down a long white road in the moonlight, past woods and villages, still and deserted, and then the dawn came up, and I saw the towers of a biggish town, and so came to a station. But long before that, I remember pausing somewhere on the road and looking back to where the hill town of my adventure stood up in the moonlight, and thinking how exactly like a great monstrous cat it lay there upon the plain, its huge front paws lying down the two main streets, and the twin and broken towers of the cathedral marking its torn ears against the sky. That picture stays in my mind with the utmost vividness to this day. Another thing remains in my mind from that escape, namely the sudden sharp reminder that I had not paid my bill, and the decision I made, standing there on the dusty high road, that the small baggage I had left behind would more than settle for my indebtedness. For the rest, I can only tell you that I got coffee and bread at a cafe on the outskirts of this town I had come to, and soon found my way to the station and caught a train later in the day. That same evening, I reached London. "And how long altogether," asked John Silence quietly, "do you think you stayed in the town of the adventure?" Vezin looked up sheepishly. "I was coming to that," he resumed with apologetic wrigglings of his body. "In London I found that I was a whole week out in my reckoning of time. I had stayed over a week in the town, and it ought to have been September the 15th, instead of which it was only September the 10th. "So that in reality you had only stayed a night or two in the inn?" queried the doctor. Vezin hesitated before replying. He shuffled upon the mat. "I must have gained time somewhere," he said at length. "Somewhere or somehow. I certainly had a week to my credit. I can't explain it. I can only give you the fact." "And this happened to you last year, since when you have never been back to the place?" "Last autumn, yes," murmured Vezin, "and I have never dared to go back. I think I never want to." "And tell me," asked Dr. Silence at length, when he saw that the little man had evidently come to the end of his words and had nothing more to say, "had you ever read up the subject of the old witchcraft practices during the Middle Ages, or been at all interested in the subject?" "Never," declared Vezin emphatically. "I had never given a thought to such matters so far as I know." "Or to the question of reincarnation, perhaps?" "Never. Before my adventure. But I have since," he replied significantly. There was, however, something still on the man's mind that he wished to relieve himself of by confession, yet could with difficulty bring himself to mention. And it was only after the sympathetic tactfulness of the doctor had provided numerous openings that he at length availed himself of one of them, and stammered that he would like to show him the marks he still had on his neck where, he said, the girl had touched him with her anointed hands. He took off his collar after infinite fumbling hesitation, and lowered his shirt a little for the doctor to see, and there on the surface of the skin lay a faint reddish line across the shoulder and extending a little way down the back towards the spine. It certainly indicated exactly the position an arm might have taken in the act of embracing, and on the other side of the neck, slightly higher up, was a similar mark, though not quite so clearly defined. "That was where she held me the night on the ramparts," he whispered, a strange light coming and going in his eyes. It was some weeks later when I again found occasion to consult John Silence concerning another extraordinary case that had come under my notice, and we fell to discussing Vezin's story. Since hearing it, the doctor had made investigations on his own account, and one of his secretaries had discovered that Vezin's ancestors had actually lived for generations in the very town where the adventure came to him. Two of them, both women, had been tried and convicted as witches, and had been burned alive at the stake. Moreover, it had not been difficult to prove that the very inn where Vezin stayed was built about 1700 upon the spot where the funeral pyre stood and the executions took place. The town was a sort of headquarters for all the sorcerers and witches of the entire region, and after conviction they were burnt there literally by scores. "It seems strange," continued the doctor, "that Vezin should have remained ignorant of all this, but on the other hand, it was not the kind of history that successive generations would have been anxious to keep alive or to repeat to their children. Therefore I am inclined to think he still knows nothing about it. The whole adventure seems to have been a very vivid revival of the memories of an earlier life, caused by coming directly into contact with the living forces still intense enough to hang about the place, and by a most singular chance, too, with the very souls who had taken part with him in the events of that particular life. for the mother and daughter who impressed him so strangely must have been leading actors with himself in the scenes and practices of witchcraft which at that period dominated the imaginations of the whole country. One has only to read the histories of the time to know that these witches claimed the power of transforming themselves into various animals, both for the purposes of disguise and also to convey themselves swiftly to the scenes of their imaginary orgies. Lycanthropy, or the power to change themselves into wolves, was everywhere believed in, and the ability to transform themselves into cats by rubbing their bodies with a special salve or ointment provided by Satan himself found equal credence. The witchcraft trials abound in evidences of such universal beliefs. Dr. Silence quoted chapter and verse from many writers on the subject, and showed how every detail of Vezin's adventure had a basis in the practices of those dark days. But that the entire affair took place subjectively in the man's own consciousness, I have no doubt, he went on, in reply to my questions. For my secretary, who has been to the town to investigate, discovered his signature in the visitor's book, and proved by it that he had arrived on September the 8th, and left suddenly without paying his bill. He left 2 days later, and they still were in possession of his dirty brown bag and some tourist clothes. I paid a few francs in settlement of his debt, and have sent his luggage on to him. The daughter was absent from home, but the proprietress, a large woman, very much as he described her, told my secretary that he had seemed a very strange, absent-minded kind of gentleman, and after his disappearance she had feared for a long time that he had met with a violent end in the neighbouring forest, where he used to roam about alone. I should like to have obtained a personal interview with the daughter, so as to ascertain how much was subjective and how much actually took place with her, as Vezin told it. For her dread of fire and the sight of burning must, of course, have been the intuitive memory of her former painful death at the stake, and have thus explained why he fancied more than once that he saw her through smoke and flame. "And that mark on his skin, for instance?" I inquired. "Merely the marks produced by hysterical brooding," he replied, "like the stigmata of the religieuses, and the bruises which appear on the bodies of hypnotized subjects who have been told to expect them. This is very common and easily explained. Only it seems curious that these marks should have remained so long in Vezin's case. Usually they disappear quickly. Obviously, he is still thinking about it all, brooding and living it all over again," I ventured. "Probably. And this makes me fear that the end of his trouble is not yet. We shall hear of him again. It is a case, alas, I can do little to alleviate." Dr. Silence spoke gravely and with sadness in his voice. "And what do you make of the Frenchman in the train?" I asked further, "the man who warned him against the place, à cause du sommeil, et à cause des chats? Surely a very singular incident." "A very singular incident indeed," he made answer slowly, "and one I can only explain on the basis of a highly improbable coincidence." "Namely?" "That the man was one who had himself stayed in the town and undergone there a similar experience. I should like to find this man and ask him. But the crystal is useless here, for I have no slightest clue to go upon, and I can only conclude that some singular psychic affinity, some force still active in his being out of the same past life, drew him thus to the personality of Vezin, and enabled him to fear what might happen to him, and thus to warn him as he did. Yes," he presently continued, half talking to himself, "I suspect in this case that Vezin was swept into the vortex of forces arising out of the intense activities of a past life, and that he lived over again a scene in which he had often played a leading part centuries before. For strong actions set up forces that are so slow to exhaust themselves, they may be said, in a sense, never to die. In this case, they were not vital enough to render the illusion complete, so that the little man found himself caught in a very distressing confusion of the present and the past. Yet he was sufficiently sensitive to recognize that it was true, and to fight against the degradation of returning, even in memory, to a former and lower state of development. Ah, yes," he continued, crossing the floor to gaze at the darkening sky, and seemingly quite oblivious of my presence. "Subliminal upbrushes of memory like this can be exceedingly painful, and sometimes exceedingly dangerous. I only trust that this gentle soul may soon escape from this obsession of a passionate and tempestuous past, but I doubt it." I doubt it." His voice was hushed with sadness as he spoke, and when he turned back into the room again, there was an expression of profound yearning upon his face, the yearning of a soul whose desire to help is sometimes greater than his power.